Shut up. Today we're breaking the law.
Okay, ready? Here we go. Here we go. Did you see that? We totally just cut that guy off. Did you see that?
Video games are great. They're an easy way to get hours of entertainment and are able to provide you with experiences you just wouldn't be able to get from any other form of media. Unfortunately, they can be very, very, very expensive. With the ninth generation of consoles bumping the standard price of video games from $60 to $70, it's clear video games are just going to continue to become a more and more expensive hobby. And the thing is, not everyone has an 100% expendable income to spend on video games.
I just checked my bank account. I got like $20 left. At least I got a PlayStation 5!
When you want to play video games but don't have a lot of money to do it, you've got a couple options. Number one, you can sell your old games for money, which you can then use to buy new games.
No! I could never part with my copy of Madden 25. Never!
Selling my video games is not something that has ever crossed my mind as something I should or could actually do. I get attached to things way too easily and have a very hard time saying goodbye to things. I mean, I've at the very least touched all of these games, and as such, I have a connection to all of them. That's right, even you, Pac-Man Fever, you little shit.
Yeah, number two, you could buy old games.
Buying used games is usually a much cheaper endeavor than buying what's new and hot right now sometimes. Since someone else has already swapped spit with this game, and it's 10 years old, it'll sell for a lot cheaper than a brand new AAA release. And it's not like old games are bad or anything. A game from 20 years ago can be just as good, if not better, than something that releases now. But then, of course, there's option C. You can get a job and actually make money to buy games.
Yeah, no, let's break the law.
Emulation is the act of, in very basic terms, forcing your computer to pretend it's a video game console so that you can play games from that console on your computer.
No, officer, you misunderstand. This is my Nintendo DS.
Emulation first started to become a thing around the mid-90s. At this point, PCs were powerful enough to start replicating video game consoles. Emulators of the NES, SNES, Game Boy, and Nintendo 64 began popping up all over the internet, and from there, the emulation scene just continued to grow.
Yeah, and you know what else is continuing to grow? Influenza, but here we are talking about the less important issue.
Basically, here's how it works. Someone reverse engineers the hardware information of a video game console. They could then dump that information online, which other people can then download to have their computer replicate that information. It's not actually using any of the actual code or software from that console. It's someone looking at how the console functions and then building something new that tells the computer how to behave like that console. Which is great, good for it, but it's not really all that helpful if you don't have any games. Which means you're going to need a ROM of the game, that being the data the console reads to play the game. So you take the ROM of a game, shove that into the emulator reads that data, and BAM! I just turned my laptop into a Nintendo DS, and now I can finally play DS games on the go.
I mean, that's at least how I think it works. I'm not actually very knowledgeable on computers. For all I know, we're using black magic or something. One second, we're gonna go make sure my computer's not possessed.
Now, emulation extends to a lot of consoles, and even portables. You can pretty much play any system up to the 7th generation of consoles. That obviously, as we go back to earlier console generations, we get better emulators simply because it's less complicated hardware to emulate. But once we get to more recent consoles, emulators become more shoddy and straight up non-existent. There aren't any PS4 emulators, and there aren't any Xbox One emulators. Apparently anything claiming to be either is a scam. Reverse engineering a console is apparently super time-consuming and not easy, so getting an emulator for a specific console takes time.
But it's a really easy way to play old games. If you're feeling nostalgic for a certain game, you just download an emulator and boot the game up, and it's all completely free. And in most cases, the emulator is better than the actual console.
Since emulators are just the computer replicating a console, they can be built to include a lot more features than the actual console did. They can make games run at a higher resolution and higher frame rate, they can be used to have games displayed in widescreen, and they can be used for ROM hacks, which allow people to go into the game's code and change or add things to provide a brand new experience within that game.
With that being said, emulation isn't exactly legal? But it's also not illegal? It's confusing, let me try to explain.
So pretty much any emulator is unofficial and not made by the company who owns the console. The ROMs of the games are also unofficial. These are just dumped online by people who are just trying to provide an easy way to play older games. But that's just the thing. It's easy. A little too easy. See, emulation can be seen as a form of pirating.
Shiver me fucking timbers.
Although to be clear, the emulators themselves aren't what's being questioned here. Remember, the emulators are just there to have your computer pretend it's a video game console. They may be unofficial, but they're also not a direct copy of the console's information, which means they can't be taken down for copyright or anything like that. On top of that, companies are using emulators anyways to get their games running on newer hardware. For example, Nintendo used emulators to get their older games on the Virtual Console on Wii, Wii U, and 3DS, as well as the NES and SNES online apps on Switch. And Microsoft used an emulator on Xbox 360 and Xbox One to allow for backwards compatibility with previous Xboxes. No, the emulators themselves aren't the problem. The problem are the ROMs. Now, you could dump the ROM of a game you own physically onto the computer yourself. I have no idea how to do that. Again, I have no idea how these things work. But the point is that it's your copy of the game, you own it, and you are allowed to put that ROM of the game on the computer to use on an emulator. What you're not allowed to do, however, is dump that ROM online for everyone else to use, because that means that people are technically getting the game without paying for it, and that's not actually legal. Kinda.
Here we go.
One of the biggest arguments you'll see in favor of emulation is that these games aren't being sold anymore. Sony isn't actually selling original PlayStation games anymore. Nintendo isn't selling Wii games anymore. Microsoft's not selling original Xbox games anymore. When you buy a game for any of these systems off of eBay or used at GameStop or whatever, none of that money goes to the company that made the game. It all goes right back to the sellers. These companies aren't making money off these games, so why does it matter if the ROM gets dumped online for free? I understand that it's technically their property, and I understand these companies are reselling some of their old games, but what about the ones that are straight up not being sold anymore? If they're not making money off of it anyways, then what's the big deal? The other big argument you'll see is for preservation. For better or for worse, these games are a part of human history, and as such they should be preserved. Yes, these games were made by a bunch of people who should be compensated for their work, but that work shouldn't also be lost to time forever because Nintendo kept taking the ROMs down.
It's truly a very complicated issue, and I see the argument for both sides. Coming up with a solution is not going to be easy. I'm not a legal person, and I know nothing about the intricacies of the legal world, and I barely even know what I'm talking about, so what I say should not be taken as any form of truth. I personally don't use emulation all that much. The only thing I do actually use it for is portable consoles, and that's only because getting a hold of a capture card for a 3DS or DS is expensive and kind of a bitch. But even then, I still only make sure to emulate games I actually own. I just prefer playing games in their original form. I like playing them how they were intended to be played. Emulation is a very tricky topic. No one person is going to have all the answers on whether or not it's actually okay. And maybe we'll never know the answer. Maybe it'll just be a constant back and forth between the players and developers until the end of time. And while I do think emulation is warranted to exist, I definitely see why not everyone agrees with it. It truly exists in a moral gray area, and it'll probably stay that way for a good while. Wait, do you hear that? Oh no, it's the cops! Do you think they found out I'm using emulators and are here to haul me off to jail?
Police, open up! We know you're in there. Come out with your hands up! Don't make me knock again!
I just got put on house arrest for jaywalking.